Hello, everyone, and welcome back to this new episode of the Rosa and Rubini podcast, Making Sense of This World. My name is Manas Chawla, and as always, I'm joined by CEO and Head of Research, Brunello Rosa. The last couple of weeks, we've very rightly so spent looking at the war raging on in Ukraine. And while we continue to keep a keen eye on that, a key risk is that we might miss one of the sort of greatest tectonic geopolitical shifts that's happening right now in the Far East. We're seeing a flurry of diplomatic activity between Russia and China. So for those of our listeners, Brunello, that may have missed some of this activity because of the headlines about Ukraine, could you quickly please summarize what's going on there?
Definitely. Everybody's looking at the news from Ukraine these days, and we are somehow shocked by what we see happening there. That shouldn't stop us to continue analyzing the events as they unfold and how they can develop further from an analytical standpoint, however hard this is to do. This week, we really wanted to discuss the bilateral meeting that the foreign ministers of China and Russia had, actually the first one after the Ukrainian invasion. And that bilateral meeting is one in which both sides effectively reiterated that there is a strong cooperation between the two countries. They want to speak with a single voice on the international scenes of foreign affairs, and they want to create a sort of new world order, just multipolar, democratic, they also call it. This is kind of stage two, if you want, of the meeting that President Xi Jinping and President Putin had on the sidelines of the Olympic Games in Beijing in early February, that ended up with a joint declaration between Xi and Putin of February 4th. That declaration said that the two countries will start a cooperation which has no limits. There are no forbidden areas of cooperation, which means that can be security, can be military, could be intelligence sharing, could be on energy, could be on economic terms, could be on anything. And clearly, the beginning, the cooperation is somehow economic. We know China needs energy, Russia has energy, but it's going way beyond that. China said that they shared the security concerns that Russia had towards the eastern extension of NATO. And actually, the opening paragraph is something that really sends shivers down the back, because it says that democracy is not a privilege of a selected number of countries, but is kind of human right. And this coming from two autocratic leaders is kind of an indication that this type of cooperation is not tactical, it's not just about economic interest, it's about rewriting history. That's why we call them revisionist powers, or establishing a new chapter in history, which means that these two countries will side together. And as we said in the last few weeks, the world will be polarized after the war in Ukraine. Russia has decided to side with China, and Europe has fallen back in its traditional Western alliance camp led by the US. No more ambiguity, no more equidistance between US and China, no more autonomy dreams or something, has fallen back in its traditional Western camp. So clearly, there's lots of things that needs to be watched in that space.
Right. I mean, all this does sound like you said, a very sort of game-changing view of the world. I'm curious what that means sort of concretely in the near future. So we know, for instance, that one of the key sort of mechanisms of this partnership might be aligning on an alternative to SWIFT, which is the international payment system. And effectively, I know that China's been working on this, and what it would do is, give the West and particularly the United States far less power in making their sanctions, make their sanctions feel the brunt of their pain, essentially. So, firstly, how would sort of an economic partnership, perhaps around SWIFT, work? But even more importantly, I know our listeners might be thinking, I mean, is there any realistic possibility of China supporting Russia militarily in their invasion in Ukraine currently going on?
So, as we discussed in previous columns and therefore in those podcasts as well, uh, there's a polarization of the international payment system going on. With Russia being kicked out of SWIFT, Russian banks are looking for a different payment system. China offers one, which is SIPS, as we mentioned. Plus, Russians are also using the crypto asset channels, crypto exchanges, just to make the payments that needs to be made, for example, to the oligarchs that have been kicked out by so many countries and their financial system. So that's kind of the beginning of that kind of polarization. But as we said, it's not just that. It's going to be economic in terms of energy. It's going to be economics in terms of exports and imports. Clearly, China needs to tread very careful there because Russia is not going to be able to absorb the huge amount of products that China clearly produce and sells to the US and Europe. Therefore, China really needs to be careful not to lose its main clients, so to speak. But from a geopolitical standpoint, clearly things have been changing massively. China is thinking about creating his new world order. It wants to have a dominant position on his hemisphere, so to speak, Asia, Southeast Asia, extending its maritime influence up to the shores of Australia, and then exporting its excess capacity through the Belt and Road routes, being the maritime or the land route, which passes through some of the key countries that are coalescing around China and Russia at this point, being Iran, being Pakistan, and others. So clearly, in these new polarized worlds, China will take care of that part of the hemisphere, so to speak, and the US will continue exerting its influence over the Americas and Europe, being mindful, though, that China has already extended its influence to many countries in Latin America and, of course, also in East Africa.
I see. And there's a very important role as well, played by a country we haven't spoken about, a role played by India. And I believe our listeners could be forgiven for being a little bit confused about what their position is on the situation. Just to summarize very quickly, historically, India has been a sort of non-aligned country, trying not to necessarily pick sides between the West and between having to choose between Russia in any kind of geopolitical proxy battles or between the Cold War, etc. More recently, it's abstained at the Security Council on various resolutions that the United States has put forward condemning Russian actions. And I mean, more than that, it continues to benefit from a lot of Russian military hardware. So it very much is in this sort of very precarious middle ground situation. How do you interpret those actions of India? Where does its sort of interest lie?
I understand that it's a very important country to look at. Actually, we doubled down on this analysis with this week, geopolitical corner piece by John Halsman that calls, India the canary in the coal mine of the new polarized world order, because India is a huge country geographically, but also in terms of population growth, and economically, because it's one of the fastest growing economies in the world, faster than China for sure, even if, of course, starting from a lower base. Now, historically, India has been a non-aligned country, as we know. If anything, during the Cold War, they sided more with the Soviet Union than the US, but clearly in the last 2 decades at least, has started moving away from that position and aligning itself more closely with the US, for example, is one of the founding partners of the quadrilateral security dialogue, or the so-called Quad, a sort of mini NATO that is being built in Asia, which sees, of course, the US, Japan, Australia, and India being part of it. So the democracies that kind of the bigger democracies that are in the Pacific Ocean, or clearly when these small communities begin, then they can grow over time, which is something that China clearly fears a lot. So India has moved away from China and to some extent Russia, in the sense that it was getting closer to the US. However, more recently, as you said, there has been a less easy to understand position of India, being a bit agnostic of what's going on in the war in Ukraine, not openly condemning Russia, even if Russia has sided with China. And we know that recently there has been a conflict in the Himalayas between India and China, which clearly put them on a collision course. So perhaps the strategic interest of India is still that of siding with the US, which might be the only ones that can guarantee the security position, perhaps even is in territorial integrity. However, as I was saying, the fact that India is not openly condemning Russia's actions in Ukraine, is still establishing commercial activities, including the export, as you said, of weapons from Russia and the export of energy from Russia, show that they are really reluctant to sever the ties with Russia. It might be a tactical move. They coming from their historical perspective and understanding that there are economic interests that you cannot throw in the bin overnight. And strategically, perhaps they are still shifting towards Quad and therefore US-dominated alliances. However, this position, in my opinion, still needs to be clarified further in coming weeks, months, and possibly years.
Right. I suppose there's no doubt then that any of this is sort of no small talk, or sort of small commercial agreements or small alignment. It really is a very grand geopolitical realignment that we must keep our eyes on, for which your insight is, I suppose, ever more useful. Thank you very much for your time and insight, Brunello.
Thank you very much. Till next time.